Hello and welcome to a rather special Scots We Hate podcast. We're down in Dunoon and I am joined by Kirsty Law. Hello, Kirsty.
Hello.
And we're here to talk about exposure. You can see some of it behind us, but it's only a small example of what's on. It's, well, you tell us what exposure is, Kirsty. That's the best thing to do.
Well, first of all, I should probably say that exposure, the actual artwork, is not my artwork. Yes. I have the great privilege of producing this show in my capacity as Helm Arts, which is my sort of arts company, my arts production company. The work on the walls of the gallery, which is painting, photography, there's poetry, film, that is done by Gilles and Andy Metcalf. Gilles is based on the Isle of Jura. He's the photographer. He's written poems, and this is and they've collaboratively made the films together. He's also a sound artist, and there's immersive sound, which you have just gone around the exhibition yourself with these headphones on. So that's what Gilles has done, and Andy is the painter, the painter of this great big piece that we can see behind us, and of lots of the other works that are in the gallery. But this is really a collaborative process that they've worked together on for almost 3 years.
Right. Yeah. So take us back to the beginning then, on their behalf, if you like. How did the idea of exposure come about?
Well, Andy and Gilles know each other from working together about 30 years ago on a documentary. So Andy used to be a documentary maker for Channel 4, and he used to work for the BBC, and then about 30 years, and he worked with Gilles in that time, and then about 30 years later they ran into each other in a tube station in London, and Gilles kind of went, "You, Andy Metcalf?" And they started chatting again and decided, had some really good conversation and decided that they wanted to start trying to make something together. Gilles' background is in quite experimental music, quite interactive music, soundscape. He's also just like a really great performing musician. And he also has taken photographs for many years, and this is actually really his kind of first big exhibition of photographs.
Yeah.
So this is like a kind of new chapter in that way. And this is also Andy's first exhibition in Scotland. So it's kind of new things for both of them in that way. Yeah, so they have created this exhibition, and its first installation is at Doon Burgh Hall on the tour that we're doing for it.
So what is the tour, so people can catch it elsewhere?
So the tour it's in Dunoon, in this room here, from until the 18th of July, and then we'll be heading up to the Isle of Lewis, to quite a different venue, to a disused free church on the wild west side of the island, out on a headland, and the building is really kind of bare bones, right. And we're going to put the exhibition up in there, and have people come along to it, and it's going to, and that'll almost be like the church itself will almost be like part of the artwork, and in that instance it'll be kind of quite a destination exhibition in that instance. And then we're going to move to the cities, and we're going to go to Edinburgh to the Scottish Storytelling Centre, and have a whole different type of exhibition using the same material there. And then we're going to go to Civic House in Glasgow, in the north of Glasgow, run by Agile City, which is a new venue for them. It's only been kind of up and going about 18 months or so, just over. So they're just renovating that just now, and they have a contemporary art collective that does all kinds of exciting things. It's in a building that used to be a press for kind of like unionist papers and stuff like that. I think that's right. Yeah.
I must go and check that out.
It's a cool space. It's a cool space, and we're gonna have the main downstairs gallery space to put exposure in. So it's really interesting having the show in all of these very different places that have very different audiences that come from all these different perspectives.
So since we're in Dunoon, why choose Dunoon as a first stop, if you like?
Well, I think it was quite important to Gilles and Andy that the experience on Jura, so they made all of this work kind of through a series of residencies on Jura together. And I think it was quite important for them not to just mine that experience there and then take it off to other places and show other people like in very different places that there. Dunoon is part of Argyll, and it's not really that far as the crow flies anyway, from Jura, and so
it's a lot easier to get to.
It's not as easy to get to, but it's there are similar kind of communities around here, and being part of that conversation is kind of is important to them as well as taking the exhibition to, as I said, different perspectives.
Absolutely, because it's interesting kind of coming down the Firth of Clyde and then getting off the ferry and coming in, and then coming into the exhibition where you have photographs of parts of Jura and other things which relate to the kind of island life. There is a kind of a relationship, I think, there. So how did you get involved then? Because you say you're Helm Arts, but you're also just seeing films and you're reading some of the books.
Oh yeah, I've been roped into the films. Well, to be honest, at first, like a few years ago when this started off, I was kind of in conversation with I know Gilles really well from working together musically. So I'm a musician as well, and I've worked with him as a performer in multimedia kind of shows, but performative shows rather than visual art shows. Anyway, I started chatting to him and Andy about exposure, kind of what they wanted to do with the show, and was sort of part of the conversations in which they were conceiving of this idea. And there might have at one point been a notion that I might have creatively been involved, but that wasn't really how things ended up going. What with work I had on, and just they started getting really down this path of creating this material, and that seemed to be like a good path to go down.
Sure.
But a little bit later on, when it really started to get legs, when it started to really consolidate as a project and look like something that could tour, I was in the process of farming Helm Arts, my arts production company, and I kind of said to them, well, if you need a hand, I'd love to be involved, and so, yeah, here I am now talking on their behalf.
Well, let's talk a little more on their behalf. Since they aren't here, can you tell us a little bit about the themes? We mentioned some of the aspects of it, but what were the kind of themes behind the exhibition?
So a lot of the themes behind this exhibition, there was maybe about 5 to 7 kind of residencies almost taking part on Jura, where they spent time together on Jura, kind of exploring the landscape, having discussions. Andy spent time painting on Jura. Obviously Gilles spent a lot of his time taking photographs around in the landscape, and a lot of the things that started to come up for each of them was this interaction between the landscape, kind of brute nature of the landscape. It's quite a exposed landscape on Jura, and and feeling quite fragile in your humanity. And also, so Gilles for years has been making work that goes that explores ideas of isolation and connection over distance, and being in this kind of slightly more isolated place, but also questioning what it actually means to be remote. And so all of these things were coming into their discussions around exposure. Andy, who is much more used to this, so he lives in London.
Yeah.
He lives kind of in the middle of London, and so Jura is a very different landscape for him, and so he's reacting to all of that, and a lot of that kind of comes up in the paintings. And he really felt like he was injecting a lot of the slightly more figurative, like this is probably the most figurative piece in the show. He was interested in exploring the really kind of tactile sort of human interaction with those landscapes, and a lot of that you can just sort of see, even in the abstract pieces are very textural, and you can tell that they've been made by human hands,
yes,
arts and things, and so really they were both responding to this experience and these conversations, this creative dialogue that they had together, and it's about that relationship between humans and their environment, that kind of group landscape, but also the fragility of the environment and the power of humanity, I think, as well. There's definitely a kind of a bit of give and take in that in it. For me certainly anyway, that's often what I get from it.
There's an interesting contrast actually between the paintings and the photography, because as you see, the paintings themselves are very tactile. You can see the brushstrokes, you can see them absolutely 3D almost. And then you've got these incredible pictures of the landscape, a lot of them, not all of them, but by machine. So you've got this flat sheen of them, and actually that contrasts really well. And then you've got this other aspect, which are films, which you see at the end once you've been through and seeing the rest of the exhibition. You've got the films. So what was the thinking behind those?
So, I mean, in terms of, I think it's like in terms of what you were describing there, just this contrast that sort of happens out here, and then you kind of go into the films, and even though you don't have the textural nature of the paintings, what you have is Andy's perspective and this very human element, the recitation of poetry, the people in some of the films. The ferry goes past at one point. Like there's this. It kind of comes together in a way in those films at the end. Of course, behind me here as well, I don't know if it's in shot, but we have the henge, which is this large installation, which is kind of in amongst all of these different experiences and contrasts and things. It's almost like Andy once described it to me as sort of the Kamai in the storm.
Yeah.
Like it's almost quite therapeutic to go in there, and it's and there's have this sort of quiet space, and that's what building the structure was about. And that structure's designed by Paddy Perring, who's Gilles' son, who lives in London and is an architect.
And some of the films, you say the ferry coming into shot. I was talking with Ian, it kind of reminded me of the beginning of Star Wars when the because it's huge. Compared to the backdrop, you've got, as you say, it really makes quite an impact, because you've got this human element, hoving into view somehow.
Yeah, I mean, starting off, it's a great shot, starting off with that landscape behind the sound of Isla, and then Finn Lagan kind of comes into shot, and it's huge, and it's like huge kind of metal, very sleek ferry, and there definitely is something like, man has arrived,
yes, absolutely.
It's definitely introducing that relationship in a slightly different way to maybe something like this, which seems a lot more perhaps about maybe the fragility of human nature in a great landscape, whereas that's a slightly different dimension. Is when the huge kind of ship comes through across the landscape, and it's a great shot.
And we've mentioned a couple of other aspects, but we haven't gone into them in detail. One is the poetry, which is on the wall. So whose poetry is?
So Gilles Penning wrote the poems, the same guy who did the photographs, and the poetry. So Gilles is a composer of music and songs, things like that. But he is known to write poems as well. These two here are ones that he kind of just felt inspired, compelled to write through this creative dialogue of exposure. A Fly in Amber is a song as well, and that's in one of the films sung by Melanie Pappenheim.
Yeah.
And that really relates to a lot of the history of the built structures, I think, on Jura. There's and kind of and memory. A big element of Gilles' work, kind of throughout all the different mediums that he works in, is memory, and so that's kind of a big part of that. Notes on a Piano is the other one that's over here, and it's got 3 images with it. Yeah. Notes on a Piano is actually the kind of distillation of an essay that Gilles wrote after coming across this kind of crumbling piano in a byre near his own house on Jura, and there was this piano that was just kind of rotting back into the landscape, and Gilles has a lot of knowledge about musical history and how big a marker in history the piano has been in the development of the music industry,
right, okay.
And the commodification of music and the history that it has of all the incredible materials it's been made out of. I mean, ivory from elephants and all of these things, and then he goes into this byre and it's all just disintegrating back into the ground, and it was an interesting topic. It was an interesting kind of thing to think about, to discuss, and it ended up distilling down into this poem, which he ended up getting me to read on film. Which was a real pleasure actually, and so seeing the piano as this almost kind of alive thing, which it feels like it is when you play a piano, and as I was telling you earlier, I mean, Gilles is the piano teacher on Jura, and he plays the piano, so finding his piano in a byre was quite emotional for him, fascinating, and as well as an instrument to create music, it's a machine, so it was just like all quite fascinating. And then one day he went to go photograph the piano again, and he found that the crofter had taken it out the byre and torched it, and then it snowed, so there was all of this ash and snow and bits of piano of all different ways, and so he's got some pretty spectacular photographs of that as well, a kind of piano at the end of its life. So Notes on a Piano really kind of
it's a very moving piece actually, and almost this kind of, you see, cremation at the end of this. It's amazing. And talking about the music, you mentioned at the beginning when people come in, they get headphones. Is that Gilles' music that's playing?
So that's a really interesting soundtrack. What you're hearing in your ears is the sound of something called the world organ. This is an outside instrument that Gilles has installed in his garden on Jura, at the land at the back of his house on Jura. And the world organ is a series of tubes with microphones in the bottom, and each of the tubes is kind of tuned to a different note, and then, like a pipe organ, the elements play the instrument. So at one point on the soundtrack, there's actually a snowstorm happens. There's a big storm happens. I can't remember which particular one it was. It's one that has a name, and he recorded that and the sounds that it was making, and the notes that were being recorded by the wind, and it's quite spectacular. But sometimes you just get a brief little gentle sound of some of the notes, and then you'll hear some birds and a far off distant cow or some sheep, or if insects come close up, then you get some of that as well, and it can be amazing. So I've been in the garden, stood next to the world organ, and you've got all the sounds of the environment around. But then if you were to record that same moment, it all of a sudden becomes heightened, and you've got these notes, and it's not just the same as kind of like a field recording. It really is the sound as heard through the world organ, and that's the sounds that accompany the whole exhibition and are particularly effective, I think, for the paintings in the Henge. So this series in the Henge is called Sounds Of, and Andy painted them whilst listening to some of these recordings from the world organ. And kind of came up with this series of paintings that are kind of surround you in this immersive way, like the sound does.
So almost like ambient paintings.
Ambient paintings, yes.
but the music does absolutely work, because it kind of, like with the best ambient stuff, you're not really aware of it, and it helps you to focus on what you're viewing, and it kind of really works in well together. And then you get this sort of thing, you take them off and you hear seagulls outside Dunoon, and you think, is that part of it? Am I hearing that? Is that the real world? But it is lovely to get. What I think the best exhibitions do actually when you walk in off the street is that they take you somewhere else and really, transport you, and that's certainly what this exhibition does.
Great, well, glad to hear it.
And people watching the video, and watch the video, don't just listen to the podcast, because you'll see some examples of it and some of the visuals as well. But Kirsty, thanks so much for taking time to have a
Thanks
chat.
so much for coming and having a look at the exhibition. It's so nice to show you around.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. I'm so glad you asked us to come down, because it's fantastic. So everyone should go and check out Exposure when it comes to a hall near you.
Yes.
And we'll be back soon, I believe, with someone, maybe not in video, but who knows, completely different. Cheers.